She killed her own child, or so the legend says. It was the year 654, inside the palatial walls of the Tang dynasty. A newborn girl, just weeks old, lay wrapped in silk, the soft scent of milk still clinging to her skin. She had barely learned to open her eyes. She had no name, no protection, and, if the stories are true, no future. The mother, Wu Chao, stood alone in the chamber. She was not yet Empress, she was not yet feared. She was just one of many women serving Emperor Gaozong. But she was rising, quietly, calculatingly, and nothing was going to stop her, not even her own daughter. The baby cried, and Wu Zhao, they say, pressed a pillow to her face. She did not scream, she did not panic, she waited, until the room fell silent again. Then she called for the emperor, and with a voice heavy with practiced grief she said, "Lady Wang must have killed her." Lady Wang, the childless empress, the highest-ranking wife of the emperor, the perfect target. Gaozong was furious. He exiled Wang and another consort, Consort Xiao, accusing them both of murder. Wu Zhao, now without rivals, would rise to become the new empress of China. That baby, the one who died, was never named. No ritual, no mourning, no burial record. The imperial archives mention her only as a shadow, and Wu Zhao, who would become Empress Wu Zetian, never spoke of her again. To this day, historians debate the truth. Some argue the infant died of natural causes, others claim court conspirators may have been involved, but too many pieces align, too many sudden changes of fortune, too much quittance, too much gain. So the story survived, whispered through centuries. The woman who ruled an empire began by killing her own child. She is remembered with two faces, one carved in cruelty, the other in competence. She was the only woman to ever wear the yellow robe of emperor in her own name. She built schools, supported the poor, elevated, talented scholars regardless of birth. But beneath that brilliance was something else, something sharp and ancient, something cold. In her path to power, she destroyed anyone who stood in the way, and often they were people she had once loved. She turned her own sons into puppets. One killed himself, another was poisoned. She forced lovers to commit suicide. She watched women tortured, mutilated, and executed, often for crimes as simple as disobedience. But it all began with that unnamed infant. In a world built for men, she broke every rule. In a palace that devoured women, she learned how to feast instead. She was the shadow in the candlelight, the silk behind the dagger, the smile that meant death was already on its way. And this story is not about whether she was good or evil. This story is about what it cost. She would go on to rule all of China for decades, but her reign began with something small, silent, and irreversible. A single breath, smothered beneath a silk pillow. By a mother who wanted to be more than a mother. She chose power, and never looked back. Before the murders, before the Empress Rolls robes, before the pillow, there was a girl. She was born in the year 624, during the reign of Emperor Gaozu of Tang. Her father, Wu Shihuo, was a wealthy timber merchant turned general. Her mother, Lady Yang, came from a respected family. They lived in Wenshui in present-day Shanxi, a place where daughters were expected to be silent, obedient, and invisible. But Wu Chao was not invisible. From the time she could speak, she was watching, listening, memorizing the movements of power in a household ruled by men. She was not taught to rule, but she learned anyway. Her brothers were given tutors, she listened through the walls, they studied Confucian classics, she copied their books in secret. They learned how to command, she learned how to manipulate. Where others saw a child, her father saw something sharper. He once said, "This daughter of mine is extraordinary. She is no ordinary girl." At age 13, she was sent to the imperial court, selected as a concubine for Emperor Taizong, one of the most powerful rulers of the Tang dynasty. But she was not chosen for love, she was chosen as decoration. She arrived at court not as Wu Zhao, but as a name stripped of identity, Kairan Wu, meaning talented Lady Wu, one of the lowest ranks in the harem. She was 13, the emperor was in his 40s. She spent her teenage years in silence. In a palace that devoured youth, she became one of hundreds of concubines, kept like ornaments, brushed aside like dust. No child, no favour, no power. She watched as the older women fought for attention, poisoned each other, collapsed from exhaustion. She saw how beauty wilted under the sun of imperial neglect. So she hid her ambition behind her eyes. She waited, calm as a knife beneath silk. It was during these silent years that her talent bloomed in shadows. She learned poetry, she learned history, she mastered calligraphy and debate. When the emperor lay ill, she tended to his scrolls, brushing the characters more elegantly than his own ministers. But she never gained his love. She was overlooked. She was nobody, and yet someone else was watching her. When Emperor Taizong died in 649, all of his concubines were supposed to retire to a Buddhist convent. Shaved heads, silent prayers, lifelong exile from court. Wu Zhao followed that path, but not for long, because someone remembered her, the new emperor, Gaozong, the son of Taizong, the man she had quietly seduced during her years in the shadows. He had married Empress Wang, but it was Wu Zhao he summoned back from the convent, against protocol, against tradition, against the wrath of the imperial court. She returned to the palace not as a discarded relic, but as a storm. At this point in the story there were still traces of light in her. She showed loyalty to Gaozong. She was gentle with her first children. She wrote poetry filled with longing, with melancholy, with beauty. She still cried. She still hoped. But something had been wounded, perhaps long ago, perhaps in the quiet years, perhaps the moment she realized silence alone would never save her. Whatever innocence she carried from childhood was beginning to rot. No one saw the shift. No one asked what she had lost in those lonely palace corridors, because they were too busy laughing at the girl who was just a concubine, too busy dismissing the one who studied while others played, too busy mocking her calligraphy, too busy ignoring her, until she returned, until the emperor broke the rules for her, until she bore him a child, and that child died. Did something in her finally snap? Or was this always inside her? She had been told her entire life that women must obey, must serve, must be forgotten, and so she obeyed, until it served her to destroy those rules. She had been told to step aside for her betters, but in a world that never let her be more than a tool, she became a weapon instead. She was no longer the little girl in Wenshui. She was no longer talented Lady Wu Sumi. She was becoming Empress Wu. This is the tragedy that no one writes in the official scrolls, that before the tyrant there was a girl, and before the girl turned cruel, she was crushed. She did not begin as a monster. She began as a child no one watched closely enough. A girl who learned to smile while bleeding inside. A girl who learned to bow as she sharpened her mind like a blade. A girl who gave birth to a daughter, and saw in her the same helplessness she had once known. And if the stories are true, she killed that daughter not out of hatred, but out of fear. Fear that softness would destroy her. Fear that attachment would chain her. Fear that in saving her daughter, she would lose the crown. And so she chose power and let the child go. Power never arrives in thunder. It creeps in through locked doors, whispered favours, silent obedience. Wu Zhao knew this. She didn't seize the throne overnight. She melted into it. It began with a bed. Gaozong's bed. He had already married Empress Wang. He already had consort Xiao, the court favourite. He had no need for a nun, freshly recalled from the convent. But Wu Zhao didn't ask for need. She offered want. And Gaozong, young and sickly, gave in. She returned to the palace wearing the robes of a consort, but her footsteps made no sound. No one expected her to stay. No one feared her. No one saw the knife behind her eyes. And while Empress Wang and consort Xiao clawed at each other for the emperor's favour, Wu Zhao stood back and smiled. She had time. The court was a hive of watching. The walls had ears. The eunuchs spoke in riddles. The empress wept behind scented screens. But Wu Zhao, she listened. She learned. She flattered the old scholars. She bribed the guards. She gifted the emperor rare herbs when his sickness worsened. She bore him a child, then another. The others grew desperate. Wang, in a final attempt to regain favour, offered to raise Wu Zhao's child as her own, and then the child died. A pillow, a silence, an accusation. Wang was banished. Xiao followed, and Wu Zhao became Empress of China. But Empress wasn't enough. She watched as Gaozong grew weaker, his eyes dulled by migraines, his hands trembling as he held the brush, barely able to sign decrees. So she held the brush for him. They called it co-ruling. They said she was simply assisting. But it was her handwriting on the orders, her voice dictating laws, her men placed in key ministries, her punishments swift, quiet, final. The empire had two faces, only one of them smiled. Then Gaozong died, year 683. She wept. She wore white. She burned incense for the soul of her husband. And then she turned toward the throne, where her son sat. She let them wear the crown, but not for long, first Zhongzong. He dared to make decisions without her. She deposed him, then Ruizong, obedient, quiet, careful. He obeyed, until she told him to abdicate. In 690, Wu Zhao removed her own son from the throne and declared herself emperor, not Empress regent, not dowager, but emperor in her own right. She renamed the dynasty Zhou, interrupting the Tang line. The mandate of heaven, she claimed, had chosen her. She was the dragon throne incarnate, the phoenix crown reborn, the bodhisattva of compassion, the lioness of justice. But behind the titles was steel. She was now the most powerful person in the empire, and she ruled with a balance of brilliance and brutality. She promoted scholars based on talent, not family. She opened doors for the poor to take exams and rise. She supported women in court, in governance, in literature. But for every door she opened, another was sealed shut, with blood. Ministers who questioned her disappeared. Scribes who recorded too much were silenced. Rumours of betrayal were answered with midnight arrests. Even her family wasn't spared. Her own son was forced to hang himself. Her granddaughter was exiled for beauty. Her cousins executed for plotting imaginary rebellions. Because Wu Zhao understood, a woman in power was never allowed to be merely competent. She had to be unquestionable, and she would not be questioned. Outside the palace, peasants called her Holy Mother. Inside, ministers feared her silence more than any sword. She wore robes of gold. She wrote poems under moonlight. She prayed to the Buddha for mercy, then signed death warrants the same evening. They called her cruel. They called her divine. Both were true. She had climbed from the lowest rung of palace life, Chiron, a forgotten concubine, to sit above all men. And in doing so, she broke the entire order of heaven and earth. Confucian scribes wept as they recorded her reign. A woman was not meant to rule. A woman was not meant to give orders to generals, to rewrite dynasties, to sit alone beneath the dragon banner. But Wu Zhao did all that, and more. And she never apologized. No woman before her had ever worn the yellow robe. No woman after her would dare. She didn't just become emperor. She redefined what an emperor could be, and in doing so she painted her name in blood. It was the first real crack in her mask. Not the pillow. That came earlier. That was silence by necessity. But this was silence by design. The year was 675. The court had grown accustomed to Empress Wu's rise. She sat beside Gaozong on the throne, spoke on his behalf, governed in his name, and behind the curtain her children grew, 4 sons, each one a string in the web she spun, each one a candle, bright, flickering, useful, and expendable. The boy was named Li Hong. He was the crown prince, her first son, a scholar, gentle, deeply Confucian, too honest, too filial, too kind, too dangerous. Li Hong had begun to speak against his mother's interference in state affairs. He requested more autonomy. He dared to hint at her stepping down when Gaozong eventually passed. He believed in a softer rule. He believed in balance. He believed in right. But Wu Zetian did not believe in softness. Not anymore. In 675, at the age of 23, Crown Prince Li Hong fell violently ill. Vomiting, fever, weakness, doctors came. None could explain it. He died within days. There was no official investigation. The Empress wept publicly, praised his talents, gave him a grand funeral. But she never wore mourning white. She never looked at the coffin. She never spoke of him again. The cause of death was recorded as illness. But court rumours whispered a darker truth. Poison, administered in his tea, ordered by his mother. Still debated, still unresolved, still written in the ink of silence. That was the first time that the Empire truly wondered. Would a mother kill her own son? But Wu had done worse. She had allegedly smothered her daughter, destroyed her rivals, exiled her own family. This was just another shadow in the hall. And yet, it was different, because Li Hong was the future. A son meant stability, continuity. The imperial line. To cut him down was to cut into the heavens themselves. and she did it without blinking. This was the moment historians now see as the beginning of her descent, not into madness, but into method. A decision had crystallized in her. Love was risk. Attachment was weakness. Even children were threats if they wavered in loyalty, and in a world that had never offered her mercy, she returned the favor. After Li Hong's death, another son took his place, Li Xian, brilliant, brave, charismatic, too much like his brother. And like his brother, he too grew bold. He spoke against corruption in the court, corruption protected by his mother. He championed old scholars who had once opposed her. He questioned the fate of his elder brother. He didn't last long. In 680, just 5 years later, Li Xian was accused of treason, of plotting to kill his mother, of contacting rebels, no trial, no appeal. He was stripped of title, exiled, and eventually forced to hang himself under armed guard. His mother signed the order. 2 sons, 2 deaths. A third son, Li Jie, would be allowed to rule, briefly, and the fourth, Li Dan, would survive by keeping his head down, eyes closed, and voice low. They had learned. The lesson was clear. Your mother is not your protector. Your mother is the Empire, and the Empire does not love. What made Wu's crimes more terrifying wasn't that they were hidden. It was that they were quiet. There were no wild executions yet, no rivers of blood, just the quiet vanishing of those too close, too bright, too inconvenient. She did not scream, she did not rage, she simply erased. There is something ancient in that kind of coldness, something that terrifies not because of madness, but because of logic, because you could almost understand her. This was a woman who had survived a palace that devoured women, a court that laughed at her for reading books, a system that tore down concubines once their beauty faded. She had risen not by being kind, but by being necessary. And once you understand that, you understand why she looked at her sons and saw not blood, but chess pieces. Some had to fall for the game to go on. But still, behind all the strategy there was something else. She never gave her dead children shrines. She refused to let their names be praised. She removed their poems from court libraries. Not just death, erasure. To kill the body was one thing, to kill the memory was something worse, and that was her true power. She didn't just kill people, she deleted them. In the imperial court where everything was recorded, where even the dreams of emperors were carved into stone, Wu Zetian left only silence for her sons. The scrolls mention them briefly, then move on, the way a mother never should. There is a silence more terrifying than screaming. The silence after justice is strangled, the silence that comes when no one dares to look up. That was the sound in the court of Wu Zetian. By the time she declared herself emperor in 690, the blood was already flowing, but slowly, systematically, like ink across a scroll. Her power had teeth now, sharp, efficient, and merciless. She had tasted how easy it was to silence a son. Now she moved on to silence the empire. The first targets were men of letters, historians, poets, Confucian scholars who whispered of propriety and ancestral law. They reminded her that a woman could not sit the dragon throne. They quoted scripture, they drafted memorials, she answered them with execution warrants. Some were exiled, some disappeared, some were paraded through the streets, robes torn, faces bruised, until the crowds understood. Virtue does not protect you from failure. There was one man, Chu Swiliang, once her ally, a former chancellor, respected, brilliant, proud. He called her reign an abomination. He compared her to the worst tyrants of history. He begged the emperor to banish her. She responded by reducing him to nothing. His name was removed from the court records. His family was stripped of rank. He died in obscurity. His bones never returned to the capital. It was not enough to kill. She had to unmake you. Others faced worse. In her secret prison beneath the court, known only in rumours, men were taken to confess what they had not done. They returned with missing eyes, missing tongues, missing fingers. The charge was always the same: speaking against the Empress. Even silence could be dangerous. Even forgetting to bow deeply enough could end a family line. And yet, the empire did not collapse, because Wu Zetian also ruled with genius. She promoted those of low birth who had talent. She expanded the examination system. She brought merit to the surface and drowned nepotism. Peasants became governors. Scribes became ministers. Women began to write, to teach, to rule over their households with state-sanctioned voice. To the common people, she was a miracle. To the elite, she was a nightmare stitched in gold. She created a new secret police, Zhou Kuai. Men without rank, loyal only to her. Their robes were plain, their faces ordinary, their methods unforgettable. They operated at night. They watched doorways, listened beneath floorboards, took notes when a child mentioned a banned poem. If they visited your home, you would not scream, because no one would hear, because by dawn you would already be erased. There is a story, uncertain but persistent. A man who called her a usurper during a drunken feast was taken. He refused to confess, so they burned his feet, still silent. They burned his hands, still silent. Then they brought in his child, and only then did he scream. Not for himself, but to stop the fire from touching innocence. He confessed to crimes he never committed, and was executed for them anyway. This was the new empire. It worked, on time, efficient, obedient, but at the cost of memory, morality, and mercy. She built temples to herself, named Sacred Mother of Radiant Light. She issued edicts claiming she was the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. She rewrote history scrolls with herself as the rightful heir of heaven. And those who questioned her did not die as martyrs. They died as criminals, as traitors, as footnotes, or worse, as blank spins. Even her own family was not spared. Her nephews, once powerful, became threats. When ambition flickered in their eyes, she ordered their execution. Her granddaughter, Princess Taiping, escaped only by aligning her cruelty with her grandmother's. Blood protected no one, only usefulness did. It is said that toward the peak of her power she wrote, "If heaven rejects me, let heaven tremble. If men resist me, let their names dissolve in dust." And one by one they did. But behind every decree, every stance, every erased name, the walls of the palace began to whisper. Not with rebellion, yet, but with fear, because even monsters cast shadows they cannot see, and Wu Zetian was beginning to disappear into her own. At the centre of the palace, beneath the gold-tiled halls and perfumed curtains, there was a room that no one dared to name aloud. They called it only this, the Iron Chamber. Not because it was made of iron, but because it crushed like iron, bent like iron, never forgot like iron. In the latter years of Wu Zetian's reign, executions were no longer enough. A clean death was too merciful. Rebellion had not disappeared. It had gone underground, into scrolls, size, poetry written in code. So she created a place where thoughts could be broken. It is said the Iron Chamber was windowless. A single lantern, a stone floor, chains for every limb. There were no shouts, no guards yelling, no chaos, only the drip of water, the silence of cold iron, the breath of the condemned. One man confessed after 2 weeks, another took 30 days, the longest held out for 72, but all broke eventually. The Iron Chamber wasn't just for enemies, it was for reminders. A general who failed to win a border skirmish, a minister who hesitated during a ceremony, a servant who misplaced an imperial brush. All were sent to learn the lesson that loyalty must be total, not just of the hands, but of the tongue, the eyes, the soul. Among the most notorious cases was that of the Zhang brothers, Wu Zetian's personal favourites. Younger than her, handsome, devoted, they massaged her feet, whispered poetry into her ear, helped her forget the age in her bones. But pleasure breeds resentment. The court hated them. Officials begged the Empress to dismiss them. When she refused, they plotted. In 705, when her health began to fail, rumours of a coup spread. The Zhang brothers panicked, and the Iron Chamber received them, not because they were guilty, but because they were no longer useful. One was executed immediately. The other, Zhang Changzong, was stripped, beaten, and questioned for days. He confessed. Of course, even if no crime existed. Wu Zetian did not weep. The man who once kissed her feet was discarded like ash. This was the peak of her cruelty. Not rage, not revenge, but calculation, emotionless, precise. Others fared worse. A noblewoman named Shangguan Wan'er, once a favoured poet, later a political secretary, offended the wrong ally. She was locked for 3 days in a coffin-sized crate. When released, she had aged 10 years. Her eyes never looked straight again, yet she survived. She returned to court. She smiled. That was the final test of loyalty. Survive the cruelty, then return to serve. Torture under Wu Zetian wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was absence. Removing your name from records, erasing portraits, stripping you of ancestor status. In a Confucian society, to lose your name was worse than to lose your life. It meant your descendants would not mourn you. It meant you were never born. She perfected this. There's a passage in the Old Chronicles that reads, "Under heaven there was peace, but within the court the ink of justice had turned to blood. She created systems of fear so elegant that no one knew where the blade would fall, and when it fell, you would not see it. You would simply stop existing." What made the iron chamber terrifying wasn't its torture. It was its logic. It was not rage. It was not passion. It was not madness. It was control. Wu Zetian had long passed the point of simple cruelty. This was orchestration, a symphony of silence and suffering. Her palace was calm, her ministers bowed, the empire functioned, and behind every breath was the iron chamber, waiting. Eventually, the stories say, even she began to visit it less. Not out of mercy, but because she no longer needed it. The fear was self-sustaining now. Officials corrected their own children's words. Wives whispered warnings in their husbands' ears. Scribes tore up pages before she could see them. Because the iron chamber had become more than a place. It had become a thought. You can rule with terror, but you cannot rule forever. By the early 700s, the cracks had begun to show. Not on her face. She had already beaten time with powder, silk and shadows. Not in her voice, still commanding, still calm, but in the walls of the court. There were whispers of old loyalties, of returning to the Tang line, of sons who had lost their brothers, and ministers who had lost their friends. Whispers, becoming knives. She was now in her 70s, still emperor, still powerful, but surrounded by ghosts. Her health had begun to falter. She collapsed during an audience. She missed days of court. The ink on her edicts grew faint, and the vultures smelled it. The Zhang brothers, her young favourites, grew too bold. Zhang Yixi and Zhang Changzong had once been tools of distraction. Now they plotted policy, spoke above senior ministers, disrespected the princes. They had power, but no legitimacy, and that made them dangerous to everyone but her. Her son, Li Xian, previously exiled, now restored, watched silently. He had seen 2 brothers die. He had survived by obeying, by smiling, by kneeling. But inside, a fire burned. He wanted the throne, and more than that, he wanted it clean. He was not alone. A conspiracy formed, not with blood, but with quiet nods. General Zhang Jianji, Minister Huan Yanfen, Scholar Yuan Shuji. Men who had once served her faithfully. Men who had seen their colleagues tortured, exiled, forgotten. Men who had no more illusions. They met in courtyards late at night, in temples, in scroll rooms after curfew. Their goal was not to kill her. That would be sacrilege. Their goal was to end her reign and restore the Tang dynasty. In February 705, before the dawn bells rang, soldiers entered the palace. They stormed the Zhang brothers' quarters. There was no trial. Zhang Yixi tried to escape. He was cut down in the hallway, barefoot, begging. Zhang Changzong was dragged from his chamber and beheaded in the garden. When the Empress awoke, the blood had already dried. Her favourites were gone. Her army stood at attention, but not for her. Her son, Li Xian, now stood in the court robes of emperor, and the ministers bowed to him. She did not resist. She could not. Her strength had faded. Her allies were dead. Her enemies had sharpened their timing like blades. She was not executed. She was not imprisoned. They gave her a robe, a sealed palace, and silence. It was not mercy. It was theatre. The once Emperor Wu Zetian, ruler of all under heaven, voice of the Buddha, mother of empires, was now just a woman with no audience. She had ruled for more than 50 years. She had rewritten the laws of dynastic legitimacy. She had bent gender, tradition, and time to her will. But in the end, the court turned against her. Not out of justice, but out of exhaustion. They feared her, still, even in old age. So they locked her away in Shangyang Palace, surrounded by eunuchs, fed by servants who had once trembled at her glance. Now they spoke of her like a ghost, not with anger, but with caution, because monsters, once created, do not die easily. She was allowed to live, but only if she stayed silent. And she did, for the first time in her life. Wu Zetian said nothing. There is something tragic in a fall without screams, something colder than execution, because exile within palace walls is not absence. It is presence without power. It is the echo of footsteps that no longer command, and she felt it. We do not know what passed through her mind in those final months. She never wrote again, never sent messages, never plopped. She simply faded, the same way her enemies had. When she died 9 months later, the court did not celebrate. There was no riot, no vindication, only silence, as if the entire empire exhaled after holding its breath for 50 years. She was buried alongside Gao Zong, her husband, but her tombstone was left blank, no title, no name, no words, a silence she could no longer break. Power does not die with a scream. Sometimes it dies with a whisper, or with a knock on the door just before dawn. For Wu Zetian, the lioness of the Tang, the only empress to claim the title of emperor in her own right. The end came not with blood, but with stillness. They took everything from her, not suddenly but expertly. First, her name. No longer Shengshen Huangdi, the sacred and divine emperor, just the former sovereign. Then her authority. Decrees stopped arriving for her to sign. Courtiers bowed to someone else. Soldiers no longer stood guard outside her chamber. Then her words. No one recorded them, no one repeated them, and slowly she stopped speaking. They did not torture her. She had done that to others. They did not kill her. They wanted her to see it, the unravelling of her dynasty, the return of the Tang name, the erasure of her own. That was the punishment, not death, but irrelevance. She spent her final months in Shangyang Palace, a secluded wing of the imperial city. The curtains were drawn, the lanterns dimmed, the hallways quiet, a palace fit for a ghost. There were no attendants who loved her, only those assigned, only those ordered not to ask too much, not to remember too clearly. She, who once summoned armies with a nod, now struggled to lift a teacup. Her skin, once powdered into marble, grew sallow. Her hands, once ink-stained from decrees, trembled. Her breath, once strong enough to reshape dynasties, grew thin. She sat alone most days, watched the dust settle into corners, watched shadows crawl across the floor. They had taken the Zhang brothers, they had taken her poets, they had taken her guards, her ministers, her seal, but the worst theft was memory. No one spoke of her rule, no one taught her laws, no one recited her reforms. She had ruled for half a century, yet in the court outside her chamber she was already a myth, a shame, a question no one answered. Sometimes she asked to see her son, the new emperor, her own blood. He never came. Sometimes she asked for scrolls. They never arrived. Sometimes she reached for a quill, only to find it missing. Even ink was denied to her. The lioness was caged. But the cage wasn't made of bars. It was made of absence, of days that passed without meaning, of silence that weighed heavier than steel. That was the price she paid. Not for her rise, but for how high she had flown. Because those who rewrite history are always first to be erased by it. In December of the year 705, her breathing slowed. Her eyes, once sharp enough to read lies in silence, dimmed. She asked no final request. She gave no last decree. There was no audience to witness the fall, only servants, only wind, only the long shadow of power departing the body at once crowned. And so she died. At age 81, alone, unthroned, unloved. The court, uncertain how to mourn her, issued a compromise. She would be buried beside Emperor Gao Zong, the man she had once ruled beside, the man whose name she had overshadowed. But her tombstone would bear no inscription, no name, no title, no praise, just a slab of stone, as if to say she was here, but let no one speak of her. The woman who reigned out longer than any man in her dynasty, the woman who became emperor, the woman who lifted peasants, scholars and women, would be remembered only by what was not said. And yet, stones crack, and silence cannot hold forever. Centuries later, her tomb would become a mystery. Scholars would argue her legacy. Tourists would travel miles to see her blank monument. Poets would write of her with awe, with horror, with sorrow, because there are some rulers you can't bury with a blank slate. They bleed through the cracks in history. She ruled for half a century. She crushed rebellions, named emperors, rewrote laws, she commanded armies, erased enemies, and wore the yellow robe that no other woman dared touch. And yet, when she died, they left her tombstone blank. No name, no title, no epitaph, no honour, just stone, cold and smooth, silent. It was the final punishment. Not death, but disappearance. The Tang court feared her memory more than her reign. She had overturned their sacred order, mocked their scholars, broken the Confucian chain, and so they tried to undo her. Her new son, Emperor Zhongzong, quickly restored the Tang dynasty in name. He reversed her calendar, reinstated old officials, and began the quiet work of erasing her from state history. Scrolls were revised. Edicts were reworded. Her reign was renamed a temporary interruption. Some officials went further. They painted her as a demon. They said she bathed in blood, that she slept with dozens of men, that she poisoned her own sons, that she smothered her daughter to climb the throne. They said she killed lovers during sex, buried maids alive, burned Buddhist temples to write her name in the ashes. Some of it was true, much of it still debated. But truth no longer mattered. Only forgetting did. They called her by new names. Zetian Wu Ho, a title stripped of imperial dignity. The she-wolf of the East, a term used by later historians. The demon Empress. She had once declared herself Shengshen Huangdi, the sacred and divine emperor. Now they refused to even call her Empress. Just Wu. A woman. A mistake. But history doesn't stay buried. And silence, over time, becomes louder than any scream. Her tomb still stands, the Qianling Mausoleum in Shaanxi, a monument carved into a mountain, guarded by stone beasts veiled in mist and time. Visitors come and stand before the blank tablet. They stare at it for minutes, sometimes hours. Some ask, why is there no name? Others whisper, did she erase it herself? That too is debated. Some say she ordered the blank epitaph, a final act of arrogance, as if no words could contain her. Others say it was the work of her enemies, a final insult to make her invisible in death. The truth is still lost, like so many of her victims, like so many names she herself once erased. But in trying to erase her, they made her unforgettable. The very act of forgetting became a monument. She is now studied more than any other female figure in Chinese history. Tens of thousands of books, dozens of plays, countless poems. Some worship her as a feminist icon, some revile her as a tyrant, some weep for her, others curse her name, but all remember her. Because in a world where women were meant to serve, she ruled. In a court where silence meant survival, she spoke. In a culture where mothers protected, she sacrificed. Whether she was a monster or a miracle, she was real. And real things, no matter how deeply buried, always rise. You can gouge out eyes, you can cut out tongues, you can burn names from scrolls, but history to true history always bleeds back through. In modern China, her name appears on museum walls. Scholars debate her reforms. Tourists walk the halls she once ruled. And that blank tombstone? It draws more eyes than any name ever carved. Because absence invites questions, and Wu Zetian was always the question no one could fully answer. She killed her own daughter. She poisoned her sons. She gouged out eyes, cut out tongues, erased families. She made poets disappear. She made lovers kneel. She made fear a language spoken through generations. And yet, she also built the most stable reign in a century. She opened exams to the poor. She raised scholars who would change the world. She gave women voices, if only for a moment. She ruled an empire of 80 million, and it did not collapse. It thrived. So who was she? Monster? Genius? Mother? Executioner? Savior? Usurper? History remembers her with two hands. One holds a knife, the other a brush, and one wrote laws, the other signed death warrants. One caressed lovers, the other buried them. She was not a single thing. She was contradiction made flesh. She was the only woman in 3,000 years of Chinese imperial history to sit the throne as emperor. And to do that, she became what men had always been. But because she did it as a woman, they called her inhuman. There is a story. A monk years after her death visited her tomb. He stood before the blank epitaph. He prayed, and then he whispered, "May all things return to silence, but let her name remain." In forgetting her, they gave her immortality. In trying to silence her, they gave her a voice that echoes centuries later. In smearing her, they made her unforgettable. Because history does not reward those who are good. It remembers those who change it. Maybe she was cruel, but was she crueler than the emperors who came before her? Or was her only crime doing what men had done for centuries? but with a woman's face, maybe she was mad. But in a world that never allowed her to speak, what choice did she have but to scream? Maybe she was a monster, but she was a monster they created. And now, as you stand before her story, blank tombstone, blood-soaked memory, shattered dynasty, you are left with a single question. If history had given you the same world she was born into, would you have done any different? Because Wu Zetian was not just one woman. She was what happens when brilliance is locked in silence, when ambition is born into a cage, when power is the only path to survive. She was every girl told to be quiet, every wife told to obey, every mother punished for wanting more. She took everything they said she could not have, and in doing so she became something they could never forget. No name on her tomb, but 1,000 carved into time, no epitaph on stone. But a question on every tongue. Was she evil or simply necessary? And so we leave her here, not forgiven, not condemned, but unanswered, the way all legends should be.